Welcome to the Filming with Josh podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Milligan, and this is episode number 114, Why I've Sold Nearly Every Lens I Own.
This is the Filming with Josh podcast, brought to you by Rustic River Media. Welcome to the videographer's home for tips, tricks, and how to make flicks.
Welcome back to the Filming with Josh podcast. If you are new to the podcast, thank you for listening in. And if you are someone who's been a subscriber for the past however many years we've been doing this podcast, well, thanks for coming back for a new episode. My last episode was September of 2025, and I feel like I keep doing this, which is I'll make a podcast, I'll explain where I've been, and then I'll come back and make another one months later and re-explain where I've been again. And I know that's got to be really frustrating. So for those of you who have hung in there, who still follow the podcast, thanks for being an avid follower. Thank you for being patient. I truly am back this time. Let me fill you in, and then let's talk about why I've sold nearly every single lens I own. I first started this podcast back in 2019, I believe. It was end of 2018 or beginning of 2019, somewhere around there. And at that time, I had been married for not even a year, and I didn't have any kids. And I was able to rack up a lot of episodes over a handful of years. But, 4+ years ago, I had my first child. And then 18 months later, I had my second. And then about 2.5 months ago, I had my third little shepherd. And as a result, my podcast time just kind of went away. It got harder and harder to make a podcast, to the point where I just wouldn't make them for like 6 or 8 or 10 months. And I hate that because I've really enjoyed making this podcast over the years. But the honest truth is, with 3 kids in the house, I've got a 4-year-old. I had a 2-year-old up until last weekend. She just turned 3. And then a 2-month-old. It has been very difficult. My wife stays at home as well. So when I am home in my office, I've got kids everywhere. It's chaos, man. And I've got French doors in my office. And so I'm able to lock the doors and lock myself in here. But it's just, it's just distracting, and I've got a million things going on, and work has been keeping me super busy. So it's just been really hard, and, sacrifices had to be made, and I chose to kind of put the podcast on the back burner because I had so many other things to focus on. That's why I don't post on social as much as I used to, etc. However, I am at a place right now that what I anticipate will be our last child has been born, and we are kind of finally getting into a groove. I think I'm able to finally come back and start doing these podcast episodes. So, long story short, I have gone from no kids to 3 kids, and that's why the amount of episodes I've made over the last 2+ years has dwindled. But I want to be back. I love this. This is a creative outlet for me to be able to come and talk about things I'm doing. So I really enjoy it. So here I am. I'm back, and today I want to talk about why I have sold, or why I am still selling, because not all of them have sold yet, nearly every single lens I own. I have owned a ton of lenses over the years. I don't even know how many. I've been doing this job for almost 15 years now. I shot with Sony A-mount cameras back in the day and had A-mount lenses, and then I started moving over to their E-mount bodies after the E-mount cameras started getting developed, and Sony didn't really have very many E-mount lenses. They didn't have their G-Master line or anything like that. So as I started moving over to my first FS7 back in like 2016, I sold most of my Sony A-mount lenses and started moving to Canon L glass and ran, and those lenses adapted for a while. And then in 2018, when Sony had finally started developing a more complete system of their own lenses, I started moving over to Sony E-mount. And so I've had A-mount, I've had Canon EF mount lenses, and Sony E-mount lenses. I've even owned a bunch of Micro Four Thirds lenses, because even though I've been a Sony shooter for almost 15 years, I, for a brief period of time, owned some Micro Four Thirds cameras, the original Blackmagic Pocket camera and the Panasonic GH4 from back in the day, and flirted with some of that glass as well. So I've had, I don't even know how many lenses I've owned over the years. I mean, it's a ton, more than I can probably even remember, to be honest with you. But for the past handful of years, I've ran about 10 different lenses. And these lenses have done a great job for me, and there's nothing wrong with them. But I am changing my approach to video and photography. And as a result, I'm consolidating from 10 lenses to 6. And in an effort to do that, I first had to sell 9 of those 10 lenses, and I only hung on to 1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain what lenses I had and kind of what I'm working with now, and then also kind of what made me want to make this shift. So my approach to video for a long time has been to use, and photography. So I do both. Video is my main source of income. However, as we all know, brands and companies have this huge need right now for content to display on social media, to put on their websites, etc. So we get hired a lot for photography from different companies or brands, in addition to video. So when I'm talking about all of this, it applies to primarily both video and stills, not just one. So anyway, my approach to video or photography for a long time has been, if I'm after the aesthetic, I would run primes, and if I'm after efficiency, I would run zooms. So my kit for the past handful of years has consisted of Sony 24 to 1.4 GM, 35 1.4 GM, 50 1.2 GM, and 85 1.4 GM. Those are my primary prime lenses. I did have the 135 1.8 GM as well, but I waited until Sony, to me that was a placeholder, and I waited until Sony came out with the 85 1.4 G Master version 2, and once they did, I sold that 135 and picked up the 85. So for several years now, basically since the 85 GM version 2 came out, I've ran the 24, the 35, the 50, and the 85. And so when I'm on a shoot, photo or video, where the number one concern to me was the aesthetic, I would run primes, particularly if I had the ability to slow down and change lenses and whatnot. On the flip side, when I would run into projects where I needed to be faster paced, whether it was doc style shoots, corporate work, where maybe I'm on like a job site, and I'm having to shoot on and work with people who are actively working. Or maybe it was event coverage. I've been doing a lot of kind of like almost like photo and video journalism for some political action committees or PACs here in Austin over the past couple years, and that kind of stuff. It's very fast paced. Anything like that, a lot of the outdoor hunting and fishing stuff I do, basically anything where I'm moving quickly and efficiency is priority over the aesthetic, I would move over to my 2.8 zooms. And that would be the 16 to 35 2.8 G Master version 2, the 24 to 70 2.8 GM version 2, and the 70 to 200 2.8 G Master version 2. And those 3 zooms would be in my bag anytime efficiency and speed was priority over the aesthetic. And then a lot of times I'd find myself in situations where I would run both. A good example would be maybe it's a corporate story, like a brand story for a company, and I might shoot all the interviews off of primes and then the B-roll off of zooms if I knew I had to work quickly when we got to shooting the B-roll. So I might like bring in all my lighting equipment and my sound gear and set up and run like a 35 and 85 combo for like an A cam, B cam type of situation, pull out the 50 if the 85's too tight, or maybe go to the 24 if the 35 isn't wide enough, just it all depends on the look and kind of what I'm going for. But I would run the primes for interviews and the zooms for B-roll. And that has been kind of my way of shooting for a long time now. And then I mentioned I had 10 lenses. I just named 7. So the other 3 I had were kind of more specialty lenses. One would be the 100 to 400, 4.5 to 5.6 Sony GM lens. That lens I've had since 2018, and I use that for filming wildlife. I had 200 to 600 as well, and didn't really care for that lens. I had the 100 to 400 and the 200 to 600 at the same time. Sold the 2 to 6 because I just liked the 1 to 4 better. I felt like it was sharper. The autofocus was faster and more reliable. The 200 to 600 also just, I don't know, there's just something about it I just didn't like. I just never really cared for it. And the 100 to 400 certainly wasn't perfect either, but I just liked it better. So it sold the 2 to 6 and stuck with the 1 to 4. So for any long lens stuff, that's what I would use. And then for macro work, I had a Laowa 90mm 2.8 2x macro. I chose that over Sony's 90mm 2.8 macro that they have had for many years now because it was a 2x macro. So you got a 2-to-1 magnification. For reference, if you're not a macro shooter, most macro lenses are 1-to-1. So you can get close, but what you're seeing is a 1-to-1 ratio. A 2x macro is a 2-to-1 ratio. So you're getting twice as close or twice the magnification, which allows you to get really close to things. And I picked the Laowa, even though it was a manual lens and it wasn't a Sony branded lens. I picked it because of its 2-to-1 magnification, and I've had that for several years. And then I've also had an extreme wide angle lens in the Laowa 12mm T2.9 zero distortion lens, and I got the Cine housed version of that lens because you can mount a matte box to the outside of it with an adapter ring that it came with. And so for anything where I needed something extremely wide, I would grab that 12mm. And we're going to talk about a lot of these lenses in a little bit more detail and kind of why I traded them out and how I consolidated here in a minute. But those 10 lenses are kind of what I've ran for a long time now. And they allow me to do everything I need to do, right? If I need to work fast, I've got the 2.8 zooms. If I wanted to slow down and focus on the aesthetic, I'd grab the primes. And if I needed to focus on something that was really close, I'd grab the macro. If I needed an ultra wide, I'd grab the 12. And if I needed to film wildlife or anything far away at all, I grabbed the 1 to 4. And that has been great. I've been very happy with that lens setup for a while. I run that on my FX6 and FX3 cameras or my A1 Mark II and A1 cameras, depending on what I'm doing. And I've been very, very happy with it. The challenge, though, has been one, if I'm going to a shoot and I knew I was going to need, primes, and I knew I was going to need zooms as well, I would be traveling with upward of 10 lenses in my truck, which takes up a lot of space. And on top of that, I would be constantly having to juggle, like swapping from primes to zooms, etc. Like maybe we're doing sit-down interviews, so I'm bringing all the primes, and then, okay, now we're going to switch to B-roll, so I'm going to have to go swap all those out for zooms. And because I have this backpack that and anything I'm going to be using during a shoot like that I need on me immediately is always in that bag, and I couldn't fit all the lenses in that bag, and even if I could, it would weigh a bunch. So I'd have to like rotate what's in that bag, right? Because that, like, if I'm walking around, that bag is always with me. And so if I'm shooting with primes, I'd have to pull them out and move to zooms whenever it was zoom time, etc. And it just drove me crazy. And it also made me feel kind of bogged down. Like I had so many lenses that I'd have to juggle on shoots, or I'd have to always make decisions like, man, I really would love to have the aesthetic here, but I really need to work quickly, so I need the zooms, or I'm working with the zooms, but I'm not getting the aesthetic I want from the primes, and it would just kind of drive me crazy, But it's what I've had and it's what I've ran, and I've made it work. But I've felt for a while now like I kind of have wanted to have a better solution. And a handful of weeks ago, I finally made the jump into trying out a new solution and found out it worked really well for me. And I immediately listed my lenses for sale and am making that transition. So let me explain kind of what I did. I have been, one thing I've been doing this year is I have been investing heavily in Teradek systems. Every year I pick one or two areas of my business that I want to invest in. This year it has been into Teradeks. I tried out the Ace 750s, decided they weren't for me, sent them back to Teradek, and ended up purchasing into their Bolt 6 line. And essentially, I have 4 camera bodies. I primarily film on an FX6, FX3, and I have an A1 II and an A1 as well. And for live stream work, I'm tired of running these really long cable runs, right? It really slows you down when you're running long cable runs. It also, when you run a long cable run, kind of limits you to where you can go. You're tethered all the time. You can't have a camera operator, freely move around as easily if they're tethered. So to me, cable runs have been very frustrating. And I do a lot of live stream work, a lot of multi-camera live stream work. So I decided that this year I wanted to finally invest in Teradek. And I chose Teradek over any other system for reasons that I'll dive into on another podcast. So I don't want to get into all that today because I don't want this podcast to go on and on and on forever. But what I essentially did is I bought Bolt 6 LT 750s for my FX3, A1, Mark II, and A1. So each of them now has their own Teradek transmitter. And then I bought a Bolt 6 XT for my FX6. And again, I'm not going to dive into all of the reasons why I chose those models today. I'll save that for another episode. But just note that I started investing in Teradek transmitters. I invested in receivers, got some, picked up a small HD Ultra 7 Bolt 6 wireless monitor that I've been bringing on set, which has been great. But one thing that happened is when I added the XT, which if you're not familiar with Teradek, they've got the LT line, they've got the XT line, and a couple others. And the XT is a little bit physically bigger than the LT, but it's a little bit more capable. And one of the things I liked about it was that I found that you can mount a V-mount plate to the back of it. And Teradek sells their own V-mount plate, but I actually figured out that the wooden camera V-mount plates actually fit it, and they have more DTAP connections. So I kind of came up with my own V-mount plate for the Teradek. But essentially, when you look at my FX6 now, I've got the camera body, and then I've got a V-mount plate that's bolted to the top plate. Or not a V-mount plate, I've got a back plate that's bolted to the top plate. And then bolted to that is the Teradek transmitter, the XT750. And then bolted to that is a V-mount plate. And then I put my V-mount battery there. And I've been running V-mounts on my FX6 for many years now. But by doing it this way, instead of just having the V-mount go on a battery plate, the battery plate is now bolted to a Teradek. What that did is it added weight to the back of my camera. And so it threw the balance of my camera off when shooting with my 24-70 2.8. When I'm running and gunning or shooting doc work or some of that political stuff I talked about earlier, like anything fast-paced, kind of ENG, news gathering type stuff, event coverage, whatever, anything like that, I always run a 24-70 2.8 on my FX6. And that lens, the G Master version 2, is a great lens, but it's pretty lightweight, which is actually, for a lot of things, that's a positive. However, when you added a V-mount to the back of the camera and then added the Teradek, when I added the Teradek, the lens actually was too light. The V-mount plus Teradek on the back of the FX6 threw the balance of the camera system off. So when I'd put my hand under the handle, the front of my camera body would be too light. And so that got me thinking, how do I add weight to the front of the camera to balance it back out again? And so I started doing some brainstorming, and really I came to the conclusion that the cleanest way to add weight to the front of my camera was either with a matte box or a heavier lens. And I have a matte box, but I only run matte boxes if I have a specific need. I'm not someone who likes to just put a bunch of random stuff on my cameras for no reason. If you look at my FX6 build, it's not stock. Like, I don't have a stock monitor on there. I run a small HD Ultra 5. I've got a Sennheiser MKH8060 shotgun mic on it with an aftermarket mic mount. I've got a top plate. I've got a handle brace and all these different parts and accessories. So I'm not saying that I don't add accessories to my camera equipment, but I don't like to add things just for the sake of adding them. I know a lot of people who put a matte box on their camera because it looks cool. I'm not one of those people. I don't want to add a bunch of clunkiness to a camera unless it's serving a specific purpose. So for me, if I'm going to pull out a matte box, I'm only going to pull it out if I specifically have a filter I need to put on the camera, like say a graduated ND, or if I'm trying to cut flare off of something. 95% of the time, my camera's being ran without a matte box. So I didn't want to be reliant on a matte box to add weight to the front of the camera. So that got me thinking, okay, the cleanest way to add weight to the front of the camera is going to be a little bit heavier lens. That's going to balance out the camera body with the V-mount and transmitter that's on the back side of the camera. So I was like, well, what lens could I look at that would be similar to a 24-70 but would be a little heavier? And that was the Sony 28-70 f2. Now, when Sony first came out with this lens, I was intrigued, but to be honest, I kind of blew it off. And really the reason was I was really happy with the 24-70 2.8. I liked that lens a lot. And I had thought about the 28-70 f2 and thought, well, I don't know that I need that lens. I'm happy with the one I have. Plus, it starts at 28 mil instead of 24 mil, and so I talked myself out of it and never really looked at it again. And Canon has had a 28-70 f2 for many years now. But the Sony version is, in my opinion, a little bit more realistic for most people to run because the Canon lens is pretty daggum heavy. And to the point where you have to like really think about, okay, is this a lens I really want to work with today or not? The Sony lens is 30% lighter. It's a full pound lighter than Canon's 28-70 f2. So it is a reasonably sized lens to run if you are interested in running an f2 zoom lens. But it is bigger than the 24-70 G Master version 2. To put it in perspective, the weight of it is actually kind of similar or not all that far off of the original Sony 24-70 G Master, which I owned before version 2 came out, and I never felt like that was too heavy. So I got to thinking, I was like, okay, the 28-70 f2 is bigger than the 24-70 G Master I have right now. It's a whole stop faster in light, and while it is heavier and might balance the camera out a little better, it's not going to be as heavy as the Canon version. So it's not going to like go the other end of the spectrum where I regret carrying it every day. So I thought I'm just going to buy it and try it without selling anything. So I did. I bought it off Amazon, got it in like a day or two, and put it on the front of my FX6, and sure enough, it properly balanced the camera out. I was like, oh, wow, okay. So if I run this lens in the front of the camera, I can run the V-mount on the back with a Teradek transmitter, and the camera will be completely balanced again. So I was pretty stoked about it. But I needed to put the lens, I needed to take it on a shoot and see how it performed. And so I did. I took it out on a content creation shoot. I've been, for the last couple of years, I've been doing these content shoots every single week. One is for a women's boutique clothing store, and one is for a men's outdoor wear store that sells like fly fishing gear as well as outdoor clothing, and they also sell like menswear like poncho and stuff like that. And I shoot for these two stores. I guess technically it's 4 stores because there's 2 women's stores and 2 men's stores, and I would shoot for them literally once a week. And when I would go, I would just shoot. There are 4 stores. I'll shoot like an hour at each store. So I'll go for like a morning once a week. And if I'm on a shoot somewhere else and I'm out of town, I'll stack up and do a morning afternoon shoot and skip a week. But you get the point. Like every month I'm spending cumulatively 2 full days shooting for these stores. And so I took that lens to one of those shoots, went to all 4 stores, and I shot a bunch of content with it. And what I did, just out of curiosity, I was like wondering to myself, like, what would it be like to leave my primes at home? Because when I shoot that content for these stores, the social media content, some of it's video reels, but most of it is photography. And most of my work is like commercial work, corporate work, doc work, live streaming, photo or video journalism type stuff. So social media is not, content creation is not like a primary focus of my business, but it was a good opportunity for me to find out how would this lens perform if I were to leave some of my primes at home. Because normally when I go shoot this content, because I'm shooting shots of people in clothing and stuff, I like to shoot on primes. So I would normally on a shoot like that show up with like a 24, 35, 50, and 85 prime, and that's what I would shoot with. But I would have to be changing lenses constantly. You know, if I needed an environmental portrait, I'd put on the 35 1.4. If I needed to get a really tight shot of someone, I put on the 85 1.4, which would give me a lot of subject separation and beautiful bokeh. If I needed something kind of close up, like to shoot, like say a woman's got a piece of jewelry on and we wanted to show that off, well, the 85 doesn't have a very good minimum focusing distance, and the 35 would be too wide for that, so I'd have to put on the 50. And then if we needed to show like a shot of a clothing rack in the store, I'd need something even wider, so I'd have to put on the 24. So on a shoot day, I could find myself swapping between the 24, 35, 50, and 85 constantly. And so I just had this idea. I was like, what if I'd left those 4 primes at home and the only lens I brought is the 28-70 f2? Would I feel like I'm missing out on something by not having my primes? That was what I wanted to answer, the question I wanted to answer. So I took it with me on one of those shoots, and it was the only lens I brought, left the primes at home, and I was really surprised by how much I liked that lens. It was way faster for me to work with it than to rotate between 4 primes. Now, I lost 4 millimeters of width because it's a 28 mil, and I remember my wide prime that I'd bring was a 24 mil, but it was still plenty wide enough for me to get the wide shots I needed when I needed something wider. And then I could go to like a 35 f2, a 50 f2, or a 70 f2, and it gave me all the types of shots I mentioned earlier, like a wide shot of where things were on a rack in a store, an environmental shot, like an environmental portrait. It allowed me to get close to like product, and then it allowed me to zoom in really tight for like a compressed portrait shot. Now at 70 f2 versus 85 1.4, you can imagine it's not going to be quite the same, but for all intents and purposes, I shot an entire shoot day with all 4 of those stores, or half day with all 4 of those stores. And when I came home and reviewed the photos, I was really pleased. Someone like me who's got like a trained eye might look at it and say, well, there's a little bit of a difference between, the 35 f2 and a 35 1.4 that I normally would bring, or a 70 mil f2 versus bringing my 85 1.4 prime. For me, I work with those primes all week, every week. So like I kind of have a trained eye for it, right? So I could pick out slight differences in bokeh in terms of going from f2 to 1.4. But to be honest, the difference wasn't as big as you might think. And there's no way the client would note the difference. You know what I mean? Like it looks good. It looked really good. And it looked a lot better than any 2.8 zoom I've ever brought. A 24-70 2.8, that especially the Sony G Master version 2 is a pretty lens, but it just can't create the same aesthetic as a fast prime. The bokeh is just a little busier, and you're not getting as much subject separation, right? And you're certainly not getting as good a low light performance. So if you're shooting photography, that means higher shutter speeds. If you're shooting video, that might be the difference between having to jump to your second base ISO or not. You know what I mean? And so like the 24-70 2.8, it's not like it's a bad lens or anything. It's not a prime. But the 28-70 did a pretty good job of splitting the difference, and it makes sense, right? Because the difference between 2.8 and 1.4 is 2 stops. This is right in the middle. So it's 1 stop slower than a 1.4 prime, but it's 1 stop faster than a 2.8 zoom. And what that meant for me was that I could show up to a shoot and, in terms of like photography, for example, that's the difference between shooting at like ISO 1600 and ISO 800, because every time you gain a stop of light, you're doubling the amount of light that's hitting your sensor. So, if I was shooting something with a 24-70 2.8 at 1600 and I drop it to f2 on this lens, I now can go to ISO 800, right? So it meant better low light performance and prettier bokeh with more subject separation than what I was getting on my 2.8 zooms. But with the speed and flexibility of working with zooms as opposed to primes. And so I found that it split this difference really well. I wasn't quite ready to sell my primes yet because I had some other shoots I wanted to try that were a little bit more involved, but it did get me interested and started to pique my interest of, okay, is this something I could do? Could I show up with a 2870 f2 and reasonably leave my primes at home and be totally happy? That was a question that started ringing in the back of my head. So that led me to wanting to try one more lens, which was the 50 to 150 f2. This is a lens that when Sony first announced it, I, again, like the 28 to 70, I kind of blew it off. I thought, well, it's a really unique lens. It's a 50 to 150 f2, but I have a 70 to 200 2.8. I don't need this. 70-200 gets you 50 mil more of reach. You know what I mean? I don't need a 50 to 150 f2. However, because I was so interested in this 28 to 70 f2 now and had experienced what a shoot with that lens would be like, it got me interested. What would it be like to work with a 50 to 150 f2? So I thought, well, let's buy it and try it. Before I sell all my lenses or make any changes or do anything drastic, let's just take it on a couple real world shoots. So I bought it and I took it with me on another one of those content creation shoots and was like, let's see what it's like to shoot all the portraits off this lens, just out of curiosity. And I was really blown away. I thought that the image quality was beautiful. But then 2 days later, there was the perfect shoot to test it on. And it's a shoot I'm getting ready to post behind the scenes of this week, actually. And it was for a big law firm in Austin. And this is the kind of shoot that I make my living off of. This is a interview B-roll shoot where I'm spending a full day at this law firm shooting 8 interviews at 8 different locations within their big corporate offices in downtown Austin, in this really big building there. And then day 2 is going to be filming B-roll. And this is the kind of stuff that I've built the back of my business off of, and the bread and butter of what I do. And so a shoot like this is the exact kind of shoot I was describing earlier, where I would typically show up and do all the interviews on primes and all of the B-roll on zooms. But I felt like, what better way to test out the 50 to 150 f2 and the 28 to 70 f2 than to leave the primes at home, leave the old 2.8 zooms at home, and bring mainly just those lenses. Now, I ended up bringing an 85-1.4 and a wide lens. I brought my 16 to 35 2.8 G Master just because I knew I needed to get some wide exterior gimbal shots of their corporate building, and I also needed to get, there was going to be one interview where it was going to be 2 founders. The rest of the interviews were individual interviews. So with the 2 founders together, I needed to have an A cam and a B cam and a C cam. Like I needed a tight shot of person 1, a tight shot of person 2, and then a wide shot of them both. So I did bring an 85 just so I had that extra lens for that one scenario. But for everything else, I shot the entire 2-day shoot on the 28 to 70 and 5150. And it was the perfect shoot to test this on because this was a project where, I'm bringing out lights and I'm lighting each interview. I've got my Teradeks fired on. I've got a client monitor and director's monitor out. I've got boom mics running. We've got an A cam and a B cam, and the bread and butter of my business. And then the day 2 stuff with all the B-roll, that stuff was semi-lit. And what I mean by that is I might like bounce a light off a room or shine a light through a window or something. But we were moving kind of fast because we are interrupting a working law firm. So bringing in zooms was ideal for something like that. But again, I decided this time, let's just shoot everything for the most part on the 28 to 70 and 5150 and see what happens. And I have to tell you, I was completely blown away by that shoot. I left that shoot knowing that I was going to sell the majority of my lenses because I felt in that moment like I could do basically the vast majority of the work that I would typically do on primes, I could do with these zooms, and the vast majority of work that I would typically do with zooms, I could do with now semi-prime-like quality. It was just, it really did blow me away. And here's kind of what floored me. I'll dive into it. First, the 28 to 70 and 5150 combo, both being at f2, created what I would say was like the ideal focal range for interviews, because typically when I'm shooting interviews, I'm running like a 35 and an 85, or I'm running an 85 and a 50 or something like that. With the 28-70 on my A-cam, I was able to still have a shallow depth of field because I'm running f2, right? So not every interview's got to be wide open, but if I wanted it, I could still get wide open at f2. Not quite as wide open as like a 1.4 prime, but wide enough. And I was able to create, nice subject separation. And I've got this 28-70 focal range. So I could go, pretty wide at 28 or 35, or if I wanted something a little tighter, I could go to 50 without ever having to change lenses. And the same was true in the 50-150. I ran that a lot of times in the 70, 85, 100, 135 range, depending on the setup in the room, because every interview took place in a different room in the corporate building. And so that flexibility allowed me to have a variety of focal ranges between just two lenses. And I never changed lenses at all during any of the interviews, which was amazing. And typically on an interview when I'm using primes, I'm having to either change lenses, or even if I do change lenses, sometimes I'm still maybe a little too wide. So I got to pick up the tripod and slide it forward. Or maybe I'm a little too tight and I got to pick up the tripod and slide it back. And maybe I'm having a hard time finding the exact spot I want to be. I didn't have that issue here. I would set up in the spot that I felt like was appropriate, and I'd pick a focal length that I kind of wanted for the aesthetic. But if I needed to get a little tighter or a little wider, I just zoomed. And that was liberating. It was so amazing to be able to shoot interviews with the speed of zooms, but yet still have prime-like aesthetics. And let me tell you, the 50-150 and the 28-70 have beautiful bokeh. Prettier bokeh than the 2.8 aperture G Master zooms that Sony makes. Not that those are bad, but the bokeh with these lenses is just smoother. Plus, you're getting more of it and more subject separation because you are shooting at f2. And it's not even just the aperture. I'm just talking about the way the bokeh looks, just the way it is. It's very creamy. And then when you combine that with the extra stop of light, it just smoked all the 2.8 zooms that I've ran in the past. Yet on the flip side, from a prime standpoint, the image quality was maybe not as fast as like a 1.4, but I never felt like that was an issue. Because the honest truth is, sometimes if you run interviews at like an ultra fast prime lens, you might come home and be like, man, I shouldn't have done that. Eyes are in focus, ears are out of focus kind of thing. That can get you into trouble. Maybe that's a very specific look you're going for some particular reason, but it is a thing where you can come home and be like, man, I shot with a little too much depth of field or shallow depth of field. But at f2, it's kind of the threshold of not becoming too fast while still being fast if you want it to be. It was the perfect aperture, to be honest. And I was really excited to be able to run zoom lenses that are giving me prime-like quality. I mean, it's just a game changer. And this coming week, or next week, I am going to be going back out to one of my clients that is a hunting outfit, and I'm going to be photographing and shooting some video marketing material for them. And I'm going to bring those two lenses, and I'm going to shoot a good chunk of what I do on those two lenses. And what's great is, for something like that, I would typically have to bring my 2.8 zooms, which are fine, right? They're good for the fast-moving, unpredictable environment you find yourself in when you're photographing people who are pursuing an animal. However, you're not getting that prime-like quality. I'm bringing a close to prime-like quality now to an outdoor run and gun type of shoot now, which is really exciting, and I'm looking forward to it. So I felt like being able to have the speed and liberation of working with zooms, but the flexibility or the aesthetics that are similar to primes was just so good that I felt walking away from that shoot like I don't need to have a bag full of primes anymore. Similarly, let's talk about the 50-150. I talked about 28-70 earlier. It's a great lens. You do feel the lack of 24 millimeters versus 24-70 a little bit, but it's not bad. However, you're gaining so much more in aperture right, by being able to go to f2. And I was a little worried about the minimum focus distance on that lens because the 24-70 had a great minimum focus distance, but I found that the 28-70's minimum focus distance was just fine. And anything I wanted to get a tight shot of, I was able to get close enough, no problems. So let's talk about the 50-150, because the 50-150, but when it first got announced, I was like, man, I don't want a 50-150. I want my 70-200. I want that 200 millimeters. Well, I have got to tell you, 50 to 150 millimeters, like that focal range is brilliant. What makes it brilliant is on a 70-200, a lot of times I would find myself not pulling it out of my bag because 70 mil was too tight. I'd pull it out when I wanted a compressed tight shot, but there were a lot of times where I would not pull it out of my bag because 70 mil is just like, that's a telephoto range, right? With the 50-150, you don't get that feeling. You're starting at 50 millimeters, which is the classic human eye perspective, right? So in this corporate shoot I'm with this law firm, I would run my FX6 with a 50-150, and I was running around the law firm getting all kinds of shots with that one lens. Like, for example, I put one of the founders of the law firm, and because this is like a very established law firm, very, very good law firm that works with like trademarks and copyright and stuff like that, patents and things. So that's kind of their deal. And one of the founders, for example, I wanted to get some shots of him in his office. So I put him in his office at a chair, bounced a light in the room, and got to work with the 50-150 on my FX6 on sticks. And what I would do is like I got a rack focus of like the name tag on the door to him at his computer. And at 50 mil, it was perfect. The focal range allowed me to capture enough of the office where I didn't feel like I needed to get anything wider on. But then when I was ready to get like close-up shots of like his hand on a mouse, his hands on keyboard, a tight shot of his face, or on his glasses where I'm getting a reflection of the computer screen on his glasses, all I did was move the tripod up, and that was able to go into that 150 millimeter range, and I can get all those tight shots. And then I looked on the wall, and there's like his diploma and some awards he's gotten, and I took that 50-150 on sticks, slid the tripod in the right position, and got whatever focal length I needed to get those shots. And I'm doing it all at f2, so I'm getting, similar to prime light quality, but in the speed of working with a zoom. And with that 50-150 range, it allowed me to do it all off of one lens. Now, I could have used like a 28-70 as well and probably made that work. But what I'm trying to say here about the 50-150 is that in a situation where a 70-200, I probably would have only pulled it out for a couple of the tight shots, and the rest of the time it would have stayed in my bag because it just would have been too tight for the shot of him in the room, rack focusing from the name tag, for example. I didn't have that problem with the 50-150. In fact, I went and shot an event last week that was being put on by a local fly shop, and I shot the whole event on a 50-150, the whole thing. I got 50 mil shots of people, vendors in booths, and I got, this is all photography, and I got shots of like the company that catered food, all at 50 mil. And then when I wanted compressed tight shots, I was able to go all the way up to 150 millimeters and get those shots all off of one lens. I didn't pull another lens out of the bag the whole time. Like it was really amazing to shoot an entire event off of that one lens. I could have never have done that with 70-200. And I'm not saying I'm going to shoot every event on just that one lens. I mean, I do have the 28-70 as well. I'm just saying that the 50 millimeter focal range is so much more useful than starting at 70 millimeters in the 70-200. And every time I've used that lens since I bought it, I have not felt like I'm missing the extra 50 mil on the long end. And instead, I'm feeling like, wow, I'm glad I got 50 mil on the wide end. You know what I mean? So not having 200 millimeters on everything I've used it on has not been an issue at all. And instead, having the extra width has been a huge win. And I didn't expect that. When I bought the lens, I didn't know what to think. And then I just fell in love with the focal length. Something else I want to say about both of these lenses is because they are a little fatter in diameter, and the 50-150 is a bigger lens when compared to Sony's 70-200 G Master version 2, which is a really lightweight 70-200. But it's not as big or as heavy as specs might make it look. If you've ever picked up and handled Sony's first generation 70 to 200 2.8, this lens weighs about the same as that. So if you have any experience with Sony's 70-200 2.8 version 1 GM, this is just a slightly fatter diameter version of that lens. The weight is approximately the same. And the diameter being fatter on both lenses, because the 150 is a 95 millimeter filter thread and the 2870 is at 86 mil. So they are bigger in diameter, but I have actually found in my time using them so far that is a big pro, because it helps you with focusing. I'm not saying for sure that these have longer focus throws than the other GM lenses. I haven't measured the focus throw. I can't say that definitively, but I can tell you this. The fatter diameter lenses, these two fatter diameter lenses, are just really easy to focus. That's all I'm going to say. I don't know if the focus throw is different or not, but they just are easier to focus with manually. And I was pulling rack focus shots, like I talked about, like the name tag to the person, and nailing it the first try on this brand new lens that I had no muscle memory with. It just is very easy to work with. So that's another thing I like. Another thing too, the 24 and 35 mil primes that I had, the GM primes, they were terrible with focus breathing. So if you did use them for interviews and you had them turned to autofocus, you're using eye autofocus, for example, you had to have focus breathing compensation on, because your footage would be ruined otherwise. If you're a manual and you're not touching it very much during the interview, not as big a deal. But if you want to use autofocus, dude, those lenses breathed so much that if anybody, as they are like moving forward and backward in the frame, just moving their head as they talk, as the focus is tracking, you're seeing this, what looks like a pulsating effect. But really what it is it's just the breathing. The breathing was horrible. So anytime I wanted to use the 24 and 35, I had to use focus breathing compensation when using them for interviews, for example. So what that did is it cropped in on the lenses quite a bit. If you use focus breathing compensation by Sony on a lens that doesn't have much breathing, then the crop is very minimal. But if the lens has a lot of breathing that has to be corrected for, then it crops in a lot. So the 24 and 35 primes, dude, there was a ton of cropping that was done in order to compensate for the focus breathing, which meant I was never really shooting at 24 or 35 millimeters when I was using those lenses for interviews, because I like using the eye autofocus for interviews. The 28 to 70 and 50 to 150, by contrast, have no focus breathing. Like, I didn't even turn focus breathing compensation on. There's like no focus breathing at all. And to be fair, the 24 to 70 and 70-200 from Sony were very similar. But from an interview perspective, I didn't really use those. I used primes. So being able to run the 28 to 70 and 50 to 150, I didn't have to use focus breathing compensation anymore. So the focal lengths I set it to was the focal lengths I was getting, which is also liberating. I just could not be more impressed with these two lenses. I love them so much. I knew as soon as I shot that attorney project that on the way home, I had my editor with me on that job. He came out and PA'd for me and did some PTS content. And I told him on the way home, I was like, dude, I'm selling all my primes, listing them the very next week. And that's exactly what I did. Nothing against my primes. It's just, I don't see the need for them anymore. And I'll tell you, like, if I'm being honest, the reality is most clients aren't going to know the difference between, like, well, I say most, at least my client. I don't have a single client who's going to know the difference between me shooting something at f2 or f1.4. So for me, I can't justify keeping these primes. Like, there's no need for them. f2 to f1.4 is only a stop. A stop is a lot. Like, when you're jumping from 2.8 to f2, like, it does matter. It does make a difference. But f2 is already so fast that going from f2 to 1.4, I just can't see anybody looking at my work and being like, golly, Josh, you should have used a 1.4 prime. You know what I mean? And again, there is a point where things are too shallow. And so, like, I feel like this f2 aperture just makes these lenses to where I feel like the primes for me just aren't necessary for the work that I'm doing. Now, let's talk about some of the other lenses. We'll go to my 16 to 35 next. I sold it to a local camera store, and let me kind of walk you through that. I have had Sony's 16 to 35 GM version 1 and version 2, and I've had nothing but problems with version 2. It's a great lens. Optically, it's very nice, had really pretty sun flares, and the image was very sharp and detailed. Just a good lens to work with in terms of when it works. And that was my problem. My 16 to 35 has had major issues for the last 2 years where the autofocus would go completely haywire. It started, I was on a shoot with, for this construction company that hires me. I'll come in and I'll like shoot a groundbreaking ceremony. Then I'll go back and I'll shoot like when they're first pouring concrete. And then I'll go back and shoot when they're putting up walls. And then I'll come back and shoot the final build out and right before things get furnished. And usually they're building like hospitals or like one of the last ones I did for them, they built a research lab for the University of Texas. And so I'm like documenting it for them. And so on a shoot like that, you know, I'm usually taking a lot of stills, sometimes video, and I would take my 16 to 35 as one of my primary lenses, and my 12 mil that I had as well. And one day I was on one of those shoots, and it was like a little bit warmer out. You know, I live in Texas, and the sun's kind of beating down on my camera gear, no shade, and the focus just goes ballistic on me. And what I mean by that is, it would just start jumping forward, backward, like crazy. Not like it was hunting. It was like the motors were just like, it was like they were possessed by a demon. Back, forth. It was crazy. And it didn't matter what I do, nothing would stop it. Even turning manual focus off on the lens and inside the camera, it didn't matter. Nothing would stop it. You turn the camera off, take the lens off, let things chill for a minute, put it back on, and it would happen again. And the only thing that would stop it is like 2 or 3 days would have to go by of it not being touched, and then magically it would work again. And it started happening to me several times. So I sent it to Sony, and they spent a lot of time with it and could never recreate the problem. So they sent it back. Well, then last year, it started happening again. So I sent it back to Sony. They spent a bunch of time with it, could never recreate the problem. So they sent it back to me. Then this year, I'm doing this big live stream event. I've got a bunch of cameras. There's over 5,000 people in attendance for this big event that I'm also live streaming, and we had over 10,000 people watching online, you know, a lot going on. And one of the main cameras had that 16 to 35, and once again, there it goes completely haywire. And I was like, I'm done with this lens. So I sent it back to Sony and one more time, and they once again couldn't recreate the issue, but they were like, look, we're going to send this to the Sony headquarters and we're going to see if they can figure it out. So they sent it to the Sony engineering team at HQ, where they only get equipment if there's like just something like this, something really strange going on. And the engineers at Sony themselves called me and they're like, we can't recreate this issue. We need you to film it and send us the footage. And I kind of was like, I don't want that lens. Just give me another lens. Like I like this lens is not working. It hasn't worked since I bought it. So they ended up sending it back to me because they weren't going to give me another lens. And they were like, we need video proof first. And they're like, if you can document it and prove to us what it is you're talking about, then send it back to us. And if we can't fix it, then maybe we'll give you another lens. So they send it back to me, and my sister's house catches on fire and burns to the ground, which is a very sad deal. And it was a house that's been in our family for a long time. And so I went home to be with family when that happened. And I brought the lens. I brought a camera and some lenses with me, and I made a little GoFundMe video for them. And while I was there, I pulled out the 16 to 35 to get some wide shots, and it immediately started doing it again. And that was the first. I mean, I had just gotten the lens back in the mail like 2 days prior. So I'd just gotten it back. It's the first time I mounted it to a camera. So I got some footage of it on my cell phone and sent it to Sony engineers at HQ. And they're like, yeah, dude, you've got a major problem. Something's obviously wrong. And we don't know why we can't recreate it. And I'm like, I can tell you why you can't recreate it. You're in San Francisco, because that's where they were. And I'm in Texas, and it's hotter here. And I'm pretty positive it had something to do with the heat, because it always happened in the summertime. And so I'm like, I don't know that you're ever going to be able to recreate this. And so I was like, I'm done. I'm not dealing with it anymore. So I took this lens down to a local camera store, and I said, will you buy this off me? And they did. They bought it off me. I didn't get the value. I got like $960 or $1,000 or something, which is way less than market value. But that's how over it I was. I was like, I don't even care anymore. Just give me whatever I can get for it. And I took that money and I bought the Sony 12-24 2.8 GM. And I've got to say, I really like it. I've looked at this lens for a while and I've never bought it because I didn't like the idea of not being able to add front filters, but I've known for a while you can add rear filters, and I decided I'm going to give it a shot. So I bought the 12-24 2.8 and loved it so much that I sold the 12 millimeter zero distortion lens that I had, and now I'm running the 12-24 2.8 GM as my wide lens. So what jump started this was the whole malfunctioning of the 16-35, but I will say I like it a lot. It is a really great lens. It allows me to get extremely wide. It's not a marketed as a zero distortion lens the way the Leoa I had was, but it does in-lens corrections because it's electronic. So I'm basically not getting much distortion issues. I mean, you're always going to have distortion on certain lines, but for the most part, it's very well controlled at 12 mil. And then of course you have 14 mil, 18 mil, 16 mil, 20, 24, have all the focal ranges to work with. So when I got this lens, I felt like, okay, I don't need the 12 mil anymore. And so I sold it, and now I'm using it as a replacement for the 16-35, as well as a replacement for my 12 mil. And unlike my 12 mil, this one, which was a manual focus cinema lens by Leoa, this one obviously has autofocus, and it has in the in-lens corrections as mentioned, and unlike that one, which was a prime, this one is obviously a zoom, so I get the ability when I am using it at 12 mil to zoom into longer focal lengths when I want to. So for shooting things like next week, I said I was going to this hunting outfit, this castle in West Texas. I'm going to shoot some of the rooms at the castle for some marketing content. And, I'm going to be able to pull out that 12 mil and show how big the bedrooms are, but do it on a lens that can also go out to 24 mil, which is really nice. So I found I'm talking about consolidating. I found with this lens, I was able to effectively replace my 16-35 and my 12 mil with it. Now, I am going to say this. I'm using rear filters on this lens, and I like it. It's working really well. I bought the Haida, or Haida, however you pronounce it, adapter ring that mounts into the back of the lens permanently, and then you just slide filters back there. And that's worked really well for me so far. I do anticipate getting another wide lens though. Supposedly, Sony's going to be coming out with a 16-28 f2. And I think that's probably true. And when that happens, that'll complete the trinity of f2 zooms. And I will want to buy that because chances are it'll have an 86 or 95 millimeter filter thread on the front, which means I will be able to use front filters with it, which for filming on a mirrorless, I have an FX6, but a lot of times I'll run a wide lens on a gimbal, for example, and being able to have a front filter with a VND. I run the Nisi JetMag VNDs. That would be really useful. So I probably will pick up that 16-28 f2 whenever it gets released, but I'm still going to keep the 12-24 because there are times when I need to go ultra wide. And now that I sold the 12 prime, I'm going to use this one for that. And this one's still more versatile because it's a zoom. So if you want 12, you got 12, but if you want to zoom in a little bit more, you can. So this is a lens that's temporarily replacing both my 12 and my 16-35. But again, I do anticipate that it'll become a specialty wide angle lens for me down the road, with the 16-28 f2 being the replacement lens whenever that happens, which hopefully should happen here in the next few months. We'll see. So that explains that lens. I also sold my 90 millimeter 2.8 2x macro from Leoa. I sold it because Sony came out with last year their 100 millimeter 2.8 macro, and that lens has a 1:4 magnification. So it's allowing you to get a lot closer to subjects than the original, which had a 1:1 magnification. But the other trick up its sleeve is it can run a 1.4 and a 2x teleconverter, which allows you to take this and turn it from a 1:4 macro lens to a 1.1:196. And then when you add the 2.8, it becomes a 1 to 2.8. So you're actually able to get closer than the Leoa macro lens that I had, which is great. And the Leoa did not have autofocus on it. And so for me, it was oftentimes really hard to get macro shots, especially if you're shooting handheld for anything, because of the lack of autofocus. The new 100mm 2.8 G Master macro that Sony came out last year is their first G Master macro. And, it's a solid lens and has amazing optics, as all their Sony GM lenses have, and has that 1:4 magnification with the ability to add the teleconverters, but it also has improved autofocusing motors over the original 90mm macro, making it a really great autofocusing lens. And to me, the ability to have autofocus trumped the lower cost of the Laowa that I had, because that was a pretty affordable lens. So I sold it and replaced it with this macro so I could have a macro that has autofocus. And even though it can't get quite as close as the Laowa can on its own, just knowing that I can add the teleconverters, which I do own both teleconverters, to get closer means that it actually can exceed the performance of the Laowa. Plus, it does double duty as an extra interview lens for me. I talked earlier about how when I did this interview at the law firm with the two founders, how I had to bring my 85-1.4 to be on the C cam because there was, I needed 2 tights and a wide. I can, now that I'm getting rid of the 85 G Master, I can do that with the 100mm 2.8 lens because it's a beautiful portrait lens. So it's a macro that can double as a second or third angle interview lens for me, which is really nice. So love that. And then the other lens I replaced was my 100-400. As mentioned earlier, I've had a 100-400, 4.5 to 5.6 for a very long time. And I've had 100-400s from Canon and back in their L series EF mount days. And then I've also had Sony's old A mount 70-400. They had a 70-400 back in the day, which is a cool lens. So I've had a bunch of lenses in this focal range, but Sony recently came out with the 100-400 constant 4.5 aperture lens, and I pre-ordered it the day it got announced. And my reason for that is the Sony 100-400 that I currently, or that I had previously, that I just sold, it's not a constant aperture lens. So when you're going out to 400 millimeters, you're at 5.6. Plus the zoom is external, and the manual focusing ring on that lens was garbage. It was one of the first G Master zoom lenses that they ever came out with. And back then, their fly-by-wire focusing was a mess. And it's improved a lot since then. And now we have linear and repeatable focusing on their lenses, which makes it easier to pull focus manually, particularly when shooting video. But the 100-400, that I've had for years has been awful to work with because it was one of the first lenses they came out with that still had that old design. Well, the new one, which I got in last week, has a really great manual focusing ring, making it great for filming wildlife when not using AF. And being that it's a constant 4.5 aperture, you're getting 2/3 of a stop at light advantage at the long end versus the older 5.6 lens that went to 5.6 in the long end. So you're getting better subject separation. The bokeh is actually smoother on this too, beyond just the separation. It's just the way it renders bokeh is prettier, kind of like the other lenses I talked about. Just seems like Sony's really done a great job with how they render bokeh these days. And so you're getting prettier bokeh, more subject separation, better low light performance, all thanks to the constant aperture. And you're doing that in a lens that's internally zooming instead of externally, and has a great manual focus design and has that power ring thing that some of their longer primes have, that you can use for micro tuning focus, or even creating focus pools with designated stops, which is kind of cool. It's kind of an interesting concept where you can literally set your focus to start at one point and end at another, which is kind of cool. And that you can do with the power ring at the front. I doubt I'm going to use that very often, but it's there. But it's a really nice lens. It is bigger in size, but it's not zooming externally. And I would much rather have the constant 4.5 aperture and a lens that doesn't zoom externally, which is great. The other thing about it is it maintains a 95 millimeter filter thread on the front while also giving you a rear filter tray. And what I like about that is one of the reasons I've never bought a 400 2.8 prime or a 300 2.8 prime or a 600 f4 prime is that when I film wildlife, like what I'm doing next week, or when I photograph wildlife, I'm usually working with my Sony A1 Mark II, or the A1 before I had the Mark II. And the reason I use the A1s is because I'm usually shooting video and stills of wildlife at the same time, like shooting a bunch of video, and then when I feel like I got enough, I'll switch over and get some stills. But also, because they have their higher resolution cameras, they can shoot 4K in Super 35 mode, where like the FX3, FX6 cannot. So I can jump into 4K Super 35 and get a 1.5 times extra reach out of the glass. And so with the A1 Mark II, I can film at like 4K 60, for example, and be in full frame, or hit a custom button, and now I'm in crop mode, and I'm having a 600 millimeter field of view instead of 100 millimeter, which is really nice. So I've always appreciated that about the A1 cameras, and I've always filmed and photographed my wildlife with those cameras because of the higher resolution sensor. But that means that I need to add an ND externally. And on a long lens, I like to have the ND up front because I want to be able to have a variable ND like a Nisi 1:5. And the primes don't have that option. The 300 2.8, 400 2.8, 600 f4 cannot accept front filters. So unless you're using on a camera like the FX6, or you're running a rail system with a matte box, which I don't want to do for wildlife, then the only way to add ND is through the rear filter tray, which means solid NDs, which I'm not against solid NDs, and I have a bunch of solids. But for filming wildlife, which is really unpredictable, they might be in shade 1 minute and in bright light the next. I want to have a variable ND up front. So I like, for my work, I like working with lenses that can accept front filters. And so none of the primes can on the long wildlife primes. But the 100 to 400, 4.5 constant aperture lens, kind of like the 200 to 600, does have 95 millimeter front filter thread. So is the 400 to 800, but that's a different lens altogether. But anyway, this allows me to have a constant 4.5 aperture, great manual focus, great autofocus, an internal zoom, and the ability to add front filters still, which is fantastic. And because the Nisi JetMag system is magnetic, when I go to shoot photos, I can literally reach up and pop it off and then roll the dial on my camera to photo mode, and now I'm ready to shoot stills. And whenever I'm ready to go back to video, I roll the dial back to video and magnetically pop that Nisi JetMag filter back on the front. So for me, that has always outweighed the extra aperture advantage that you gain on the primes. Yes, it's beautiful to shoot wildlife on a 400 2.8 or 600 f4, but because I do stills and video, and I work with a camera like the A1 when shooting wildlife, just having the ability to have front filters on the front, to me, is a difference maker. The other thing about this lens, in my initial testing with it, is that it actually handles the teleconverter really well. So the previous 100 to 400 was horrible with teleconverters. I didn't like the way it looked with teles, so I never used them with that lens. The 200 to 600 actually could handle teleconverters better than the old 100 to 400, but it was a slower lens to begin with. And I just never even thought the lens was as sharp as my old 100 400, which is interesting. It wasn't as sharp, but it handled teleconverters better. Kind of didn't make sense, but it's true. However, this lens is sharper than the 200 to 600, and unlike the previous 100 400, it handles teleconverters really well. In fact, when I tested it at a local park recently with the 1.4 times tele on this lens, which is giving you a 560 millimeter reach at f6.3, which is very similar to the 200 to 600, which goes out to 600 at f6.3. You're only off by 40 mil. Aperture's the same. But I found that at 560 millimeters 6.3 aperture on the 100 to 400, which has the tele on it, actually was giving me better results, better image quality than what I got on the 200 to 600 without a teleconverter. And because it's better image quality, you can crop in more because the image is holding up better. So ironically, even though it's 200 millimeters less than the 200 to 600, when you add the tele, in my opinion, outperformed it with the tele on it. And the 200 600 never had great autofocusing motors because it was a G lens. GM lenses have better autofocusing motors. And so this lens with the teleconverter on it outperformed the autofocus performance that I had on the 200 600 I used to own. So it just like going out and experimenting with this lens with the 1.4 times tele was amazing and showed me that this lens not only beats the 100 to 400 and by having an internal zoom and a constant aperture and a really great manual focus, but now on top of that, I can add teles and it can hold the tele really well. Now there also is a 2 times teleconverter, which I have not tested on this lens yet, but I'm taking it with me to, I did recently purchase one. In fact, it's getting delivered today, and I plan to take it with me next week to West Texas to this ranch that I'm going to try out on this lens. And from what I've seen online, it looks like it's going to do really well, the 2.8, the 2 times teleconverter, which will turn this from a 100 to 400 4.5 into a 200 to 800 f9, which f9 sounds kind of slow, but when you look at Sony's 400 to 800 lens they came out with a while back, that lens, which is a nice lens, it is a 6.3 to f8. So if you are out at 800 millimeters, you're at f8, and the difference between f8 and f9 is only a third of a stop. So this lens with a 2 times tele is only 1/3 of a stop slower than the actual 400 to 800 that Sony makes, which to me makes this lens more appealing because you can take the tele off and have a 1 to 4, 4.5. So to me, it's more versatile, and I'm excited to try it out with with a 2 times tele. I don't expect the performance to be quite as good as the 400 to 800 lens by itself, but I don't think it'll be all that far off, to be honest. I could be wrong, but from what I've seen online, I think that's going to be the case. So excited for that. But that's essentially what I've done. Is it started with the 28 to 70 f2 and then morphed into the 5150 f2, which made me feel like, okay, I don't need these primes anymore. And then I don't need the 2.8 zooms anymore. And I don't need the 12 mil because I have the 12 to 24 now. And I don't need the 90 millimeter macro because Sony came out with this new macro. And I don't need the 100, 400, 4.5 to 5.6 because now we have a 100, 400, 4.5. And so I was able to swap out my lenses for some newer versions and then sell off lenses I just don't need anymore, like the primes, because the f2 zooms made it to where I feel like that is no longer needed. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast that I kept one lens, and that lens is the 51.2. I kept that lens because that is one of my favorite lenses of all time. It's just a beautiful lens. It's great to work with, works really well with my teleprompter. And when you do want a shallow depth of field, like a crazy shallow depth of field, if you want it for some reason, it can sure give it to you. 51.2 is a beautiful lens, and it has a very close minimum focus distance, making it really easy to get close to subjects. And when you combine that with the 1.2 aperture and the 50 millimeter focal length, you can create insane shallow depth of field shots, which aren't the right fit for every scenario. But if you want it, it's there. So to round it out, I sold my 24, I sold my 35, I sold my 85, and sold my 16 to 35, my 24 to 70, my 7200, my 12 mil, my 90 macro, and my 100 to 400. And now my kit currently consists of 6 lenses, the 12 24 2.8, the 28 to 70 f2, the 5150 f2, the 100 millimeter 2.8 macro, the 51.4, and the 100 to 400 4.5. 6 lenses instead of 10, with me wanting to add a 7th, that 16 to 28 f2, if and when that comes out, which I do think it will come out, and I do think it'll be soon. And so that'll allow me to consolidate my lens selection down some. Plus, some of those lenses I mentioned are specialty lenses. Not every shoot needs a 100 to 400 or a 51.2 or a macro or an ultra wide. So I think where I'm really going to see the benefit is when I'm on a job where I'd normally carry 4 primes and 3 zooms. That's 7 lenses. I can now show up with 3, a wide, a medium, and a tight, and do pretty much the same job I was getting for the most part with my primes while maintaining the speed and flexibility of zooms. and still being able to get wide, medium, and tight shots with 3 lenses instead of having to bring 7. That's where I see the biggest difference coming. So cutting 3, I've went from 10 lenses to 6, going to pick up a 7th, but it's that going to a shoot and being able to carry on most shoots 3 lenses instead of 7, where I think I'm going to really see the benefit. And I'm really, really excited for that. So I know it's a longer podcast, but I wanted to kind of just walk through my thought process, like what made me want to sell off lenses and buy new lenses and consolidate my lens selection. And that's how I ended up where I'm at. And I have to tell you guys, I like being here. I feel inspired a little bit because it could be a little taxing at times to constantly be swapping primes, but then I'd go shoot with the zooms and be like, oh, I miss my primes. I like the aesthetics. To be able to go out and be like, man, I have the speed and workflow efficiency of my zooms, but quality similar to my primes is refreshing. It's liberating, and it makes me want to go shoot more. And I'm excited for that. And I think it'll make me more efficient in my client work because I'm not going to have to interrupt a shoot to be rotating lenses as much anymore. But I'm also going to be delivering results that still look very aesthetically pleasing. And I'm really, really excited for that. So that's all for this episode of the podcast. And I plan to be back within the next 1 to 2 weeks. Hopefully next week when I get back from that shoot in West Texas. I would like to come back and do an episode and talk about what I'm doing out there and some of the equipment I took and kind of how I operated there. But if there's anything in particular you would like to hear about, let me know. If you're not subscribed to this podcast yet, just note we are on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. I try to upload YouTube versions of this podcast when I can, but I have found that to be more difficult to do with the kids. So I'll do that when I'm able, but a lot of the podcast is going to be audio driven, which is how it was the first 100 episodes. So anyway, I'm glad to be back and to be doing another podcast. It's been too long. It feels great. And I can't wait to come back and hopefully come back next week when I get back from my shoot. And again, guys, if you're not subscribed, please subscribe and leave us a review. Let us know how you like it. Thanks. Take care.
To learn more about Rustic River Media, visit us online at rusticriver.media. Thanks for listening to the Filming with Josh podcast. Catch every episode by hitting subscribe today.